Welcome back to the Information Revolution, a podcast for people working with information and interested in it. My name's Michael Upton. I'm an information management consultant and I'm based in Wellington, New Zealand.
My name is Judi Vernau. I'm an information architect. I'm usually to be found in Wellington, New Zealand, but right now I'm in London.
And I'm Karl Melrose. I'm an information management consultant based out of Adelaide in Australia. And Michael, information asset registers, your favourite topic?
A great lead in, thank you, Carl.
You're welcome.
So, yeah, I was saying before we started recording that despite almost all of these episodes where we bang on about how valuable it is to know about your information and what you've got and all of that, when people in real life say to me, "Oh, we're working on an information asset register," I just have this really sinking feeling about that. I'm always like, "Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that." And so we have, we've obviously talked around the topics of information discovery and around. I'm sure we've referred directly to information asset registers multiple times. And so we thought it would be a useful thing to have a bit of a chat about them and about the activity and what's it all about, really. Because in most any jurisdiction, there's an expectation that that's part of our working life and information and records is, create one of these things. So I guess what I'd say um, is that I mean, the really short version is I see them really blow out. I see people spend months and months and months working on what essentially ends up as a spreadsheet that sits somewhere. And if we're going to go back to good old valuation, like what's the value in that artifact versus the cost and effort of establishing the damn thing? And I guess rather than just be a bit grisly about it, I thought, it might be really useful to think about, well, what would make one work? And perhaps you too. I mean, you might have much more positive experiences than I've had. I guess, um, or and on the flip side, perhaps we could talk about some of the pitfalls. I would just kick that off. I mean, one thing that I've seen that I've found very challenging for people is if you essentially think of each asset as a row in your beautiful spreadsheet. Um, I see people dispute endlessly what is a row. So what's an asset? What's one asset versus five assets versus, well, the other way around, I guess, like all these things that should be subsets of one row. And I think um, the thing that makes it hard to agree on those things is typically because you're actually not clear why you're doing it. You're doing an information asset register because you've been told you need an information asset register. And so if you can't visualize how you're going to use the outputs of the work and go, oh, yeah, cool, well, we need to know this much about this thing, then it's hard to say what's a good thing, what's a good row, what's the right level of information to be working with.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I've worked on 3 big information asset registers. We didn't actually call them that, I don't think, in any of those places. One for the NHS, one for a council, and one for a government department that had offices all around the world. And uh, one of those was because they had security breaches and they realized that they had no handle on what was where and what was happening to it. And so, how could they protect it? So, they needed to know every single information asset, as you say. I prefer to call them information sets, which I think of as information which is created for a purpose, but it's in a particular form for that purpose and in a particular location. Which brings me on to uh, another client where they're preparing for a move to they're going to migrate everything. Well, if you're going to migrate stuff, you need to know what all these things are. You need to know what format it's in. You need to know what the purpose is. and where it is obviously at the moment, so that you can then do something sensible with each of those assets, if you like. But you have to be quite specific, take it down to individual information sets in order to decide what you're going to do with all that stuff. So that's another reason. In the NHS, it was more about joining up. Well, they said they had no governance around. It was a particular part of the NHS, no governance around the information that they were collecting, and they were collecting a huge amount of data coming in, being munged, going out. But what is it? What have we got here at any one time? What's coming in? How does it relate to what we're doing with this stuff in house? How does that relate to what it is then we're passing on to others? So our information asset register, if you want to call it that, had to map all of those things. This is what's coming in, this is what's here, and this is what's going out. And again, it was quite detailed. But I don't know, in my experience, people agonize a lot about information asset registers rather than just getting on with it. If I can put it like that. And yes, you need to decide what your fields are, what your metadata is, depending on what exactly your problem is. But there's so much guidance around this stuff now. I wouldn't have thought it needed to be that difficult. I mean, obviously, with the NHS and the data sets, there needed to be fields to record each data set's relationship with other things. But you might want that anyway, according to all kinds of things that you might be doing with it. You want to know what's got personal information and what hasn't. I mean, that's clearly very important. You need to know who the owner is. But once you get going, once you can sort that out and agree it according to what your exact purpose is, then it's just work to get on and do it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I really feel like that work should be pretty short, shouldn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, of course, the bigger the organization and the more complex the information environment, then, of course, the more effort required. But I guess that's the thing that I find sort of overwhelmingly is like, why is this taking years? Why are people,
it shouldn't do.
sure,
It
it's
totally
elapsed time,
shouldn't
right? It's
do.
not, yeah.
I mean, for me, that there's a number of factors in anything that we do, but it's kind of how does it help us take action? What's catalytic about the register? What processes is it supposed to drive afterwards? And if people want to do a one point in time, snapshot of how they think about their information, I mean, I think that can be useful, but it's kind of one and done. Maybe it solves a problem, gives you some situational awareness, but I really, how does it help us take action? What does it help us take action on? Who cares about that? How much of a priority is it? What problem does it solve for them? I mean, I've worked on two specifically, and one was for a small local government organisation, and the other one was for a very large financial institution. And the government organisation, I don't think they've done any maintenance. I don't think they've used it. I don't think they are doing anything with it. The financial institution, they've baked it in to risk reporting that goes all the way to their board, and it's being done in quite a strategic manner. And the thing that makes that interesting is that they were looking at literally everything. So they started out with documents and those sorts of things, but then they moved on to do structured data and everything else, and it's really the
Hmm.
basis for a whole set of ongoing activities around managing information life cycles across the whole organization to reduce well understood and well identified risks. And I don't know what the long term plan for that organization is. I wouldn't imagine that that thing being filled up by people is necessarily the long term plan, but it's definitely the thing that's helped get started. And I can't really think of another way that you would. You've got to go from you've got to go from no situational awareness whatsoever to some situational awareness somehow. and there's that I think it was John Howard who said something about there's a difference between knowing and knowing. You can kind of have a sense that something's going on, but until particularly if you're in an official position, until somebody actually puts a report on your desk and says this was done by XYZ and it's rigorous and trustworthy, and you can take it to Parliament and stand in front of them. I think the information asset register helps you get to that level of knowing. And once you really know like that, I think you can really actually take some action. I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting too because the two polar approaches as well. One done by one done by people who understand information and records and know what they're doing through a sort of interview process. The other one very much a kind of top down approach. The other one very much a bottom up approach. And the really interesting thing was that actually I don't think I'd ever really thought about it until you were talking about it there, Judi. But one of those was not the one done by experts, not definitionally challenged at all. What do you use? Where is it? When you're doing your work during the day, all those sorts of interview questions. No definitional challenges whatsoever. The other one plagued by definitional challenges, trying to bring people's level of understanding up to, think about what records are and how they work
Oh,
and everything else. Exactly as you said, one location, one classification, well, what's a classification? And, all of those things. But I mean, I think the reflecting on that, I think doing it that way, because again, it was one of those things, high visibility, real catalytic, strategic kind of focus. I think it really raised the level of understanding about information and records in the organization, really got people to think about it.
I think
And
it can help hugely for that. I also think, just picking up something you said there about top down, bottom up, if you're trying to get a real handle on what's out there, then you do need to do both, because if you just interview people, and it's perfectly reasonable to do an IAR that is just interviewing people, but if you really want to understand, maybe because you're trying to migrate things or to understand all the risks, you need to do both, because when you talk to people and they say, well, we use this and we've got this database here and I've got this drawer full of records here, um, but then there's always that stuff that nobody lays claim to. And so you need to do that bottom up. Okay, well, we're going to look across these drives and see if they match up with what people are telling us. So people are telling us that they're using this drive, for example, or they're using these SharePoint sites. And if you just went with what people told you, you'd think there were, I don't know, 200 SharePoint sites. But when you look properly, there's 10,000. And
yeah,
same with that, with a shared drive. There's always going to be loads of stuff that nobody claims. And what are you going to do about that? Because that needs to be identified in your asset register as well.
No
yeah,
doubt.
completely. And I think that's one of the areas too where that makes structured versus unstructured data really interesting in these sorts of scenarios. Because I think almost every organization, at least these days with any kind of IT maturity, has a list somewhere of all of their systems and what
Yeah.
they do. And the nice thing about structured data systems is, I mean, they're structured. You can sit down pretty quickly and say this is what it does. So I mean, to actually do an appraisal of that system and the content that it's extremely likely to hold, I think is very simple. And it was one of the things that I've really been thinking about with some of these very automated, auto classifier based um, record systems, particularly the manage in place systems that we're starting to see spring up now. I think that's one of the real advantages that they have. Whatever process you've got to go through to train or code those classes, I think once you've got them, as long as you can connect one of those systems to your unstructured repositories, I mean, I think your level of visibility can go from nothing to total reasonably quickly. And I think that the level of granularity and rigor that you can get to quickly as well, I think is, I think that's one of the real assets that they provide, and it's interesting. I got a call from a friend about 6 or 8 weeks ago who's landed at a little agency that just has nothing in terms of information and records really, and it's one of these short-term agencies, so they're going to be wound up, some probably within about the next 12 months, I think. Just their purposes at an end, they'll get folded back into a bigger agency, and they'll have to. It's kind of like with that Royal Commission that we were talking about a couple of episodes back with you, Michael. It's that sort of scenario, but they don't have anything. So this friend is trying to figure out how to get visibility, and I'm really thinking hard at the moment about, well, they've got Microsoft 365 and they're doing everything in it. How can we use the tools there to help get some visibility of what's there? And really what I'm thinking about is how do we build a quick and dirty information asset register in a relatively automated way?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's a friend of ours too that is at one of the councils, and they moved everybody onto Microsoft 365 a number of years ago, and they have a business process there where every time a team is created, they get a tap from the records management team to say, "Hey, you've created a new team. What's it for?" And because they've got a register of all of the existing teams and what all of those existing teams are used for, they've actually managed to control a lot of their team's usage by just going back to that register to say, "Oh, you've created it for managing city assets. Oh, did you know that we've already got a team for managing city
You
assets?
would
And
hope.
we've actually created, we've actually added all of this extra stuff in there to help people manage those things. Did you know about that?" And they're actually controlling a whole heap of they've managed to massively reduce the number of teams that are being created by just kind of having a trigger point to say, "What are you using that for?" We've already got one of those. And I mean, how often how often does everybody, create a whole new information asset because we just don't know the other one exists? I mean, that's the dark data problem. I think I think that's really innovative, but very simple.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also comes back to talking about common language and so forth in previous episodes, that that thing of how we talk about our work shifting over time sometimes means that people are basically recreating something just because the language around it's shifted. So, like that you might have, I don't know, something that you might have described as asset management, as an infrastructure, or, physical assets. And then you might suddenly, that might not be the flavor of the month anymore. And you might talk about the built environment or something. And, and suddenly you charge off and create a new thing.
Does this mean we need to have an episode about business glossaries? Because I feel like you were starting to go in that direction.
Anytime.
Uh, well, I was going to comment on, I mean, so the kind of, we're calling out the idea of a kind of mixed approach, which I'm sure we've talked about in terms of information discovery or stock takes or whatever before, where, what tools have we got to basically understand the content, analyze from a content perspective what on earth's going on, versus basically the people contact, going to humans and going, "Hey, what are you doing and what information do you need to do that work," and so on. I wonder if a huge amount of what gets complicated about asset registers and things could actually be addressed if you went content first rather than person first. So rather than interviews, if you basically started with trying to do that, just, if you got hold of sort of basically a system architecture, like technical architecture, or a list of what systems are there, and then just went, okay, well, what's in each one of these? I wonder how much you could
Yeah.
build out that would, in terms of sort of not overcooking something. Like, would you get 70% of the value before you even talk to a person? Like, I kind of
I
wonder.
don't think you would. I don't think you
Okay.
would. I think you do need to do both, as I said before,
Hmm.
because otherwise stuff gets missed. But if you get a list, I've done this. If you get a list of all the SharePoint sites, for example, it's not
Mm.
always. I mean, depends how much metadata was captured about each one, but it's not always possible to tell. People call things all kinds of daft stuff. It's not always possible to understand what the purpose of that is, and you don't really want to have to go and look at the content itself of everything. And if they've ascribed an owner and a team and so on, then that makes life easier. But you still don't necessarily know what it is. But you do need that list in order to do the kind of backwards and forwards verification.
Sounds
And
like there's a difference between knowing and
yeah,
knowing.
yes, exactly. And if the organisation has a list of all their databases, if they do, and I've seen some quite dodgy ones of those, but if they do, that's also obviously a very good place to start.
Cool. Yeah,
And
yeah.
that question of what problem does it solve for us,
Mm,
and is that problem important enough to keep continued pressure on this thing, well, to put enough pressure on people to take it seriously initially, and then to keep enough pressure on it over time to keep that virtuous cycle going so that the
mm,
quality improves rather than things ending up on there and never having a process for being removed and those kinds of things. I mean, I think there's a real information governance type discussion there. How do
definitely.
we allocate the ability to people to say, yes, we are going to create a new information asset somewhere, so that there is a trigger for having it added to the register? How do we make people responsible for these things? I
Yeah.
mean, how do we specify quality? Um, and back at the start of one of the comments you made there, Michael, one of the parts that I was a little bit, not just critical but self-critical of after one of these processes is that I felt like we should have started kind of exactly as you said, almost with like tree size, and
Mm,
okay, here's tree size, and we've got the tree, and we're going to agree that we want to tick off literally everything at a certain level in the organization. And we're going to get to a point at the end of this process where, we've gone 3 levels down on the share drive and 3 levels down on whatever, whatever the decision is. And if we haven't ticked something off, then we have a process for going back and saying, well, this either isn't being used, so it's orphan data of some kind, that we should move it somewhere, basically to see who complains, so that we can actually fix that part of the catalog, or do something with it. Yeah, I feel like that should have been a place we started.
Hmm. One thing on my mind in terms of sort of where to start would be back to the whole idea of purpose. Lurking in the back of my head is something that Doug Laney said in his episode about when you're valuing stuff, what that initial value is isn't as important as then continuing to measure and continuing to understand basically what's the trend? Are you increasing value or are you decreasing value? And I feel like there's something there that's applicable to this that's to do with that idea of like, okay, well, say we want to improve our information security profile, like in one of your examples, Judy, you know, let's ask what information we need to manage that risk and then just capture enough and then do some actions that might be just related to, a small number of assets or a small amount of information about many assets, whichever way you want to go, kind of shallow and broad or deep, but only about a few things. And then try using the information that you've collected for the purpose for which you thought you were collecting it, and then see, is that working? Like, is that enough? Like, is that actually driving a positive change? And I sort of think maybe what I've seen go wrong with these things in the past. I mean, certainly, as I said at the start, like often it just comes back to this idea that you're basically just doing it because you're supposed to, and so you're unclear on that value. But if we could just do a small part of the work rather than trying to complete it all, and then sort of just um, see whether it's useful. Basically, it's hypothesis testing, really.
Yeah, time box it.
yeah.
We're gonna spend a week on
Yes.
this, and then we're going to give it to everyone and see, do they get use out of it? And
Yeah. And make
I
it
made a,
publicly available.
I mean, I made a note to talk about, to bring up the Doug Laney episode as well, based on something that one of you said, because that, I mean, he's really focusing there on sort of monetizing what you've got in some way, shape, or form. And I mean,
Mm,
obviously, if you want to do that, the first thing you've got to do is give people who can think about that sort of thing a sense of what you've got. It's kind of a necessary first step. And I really don't see how you would I mean, ways you'd approach that. Somebody would have a hypothesis that we've got all of this stuff, and somebody else would, um, and we think somebody else might be able to use it. But I mean, when you think about some of these programs, like the New South Wales government program that I've just forgotten the name of, that populates a whole bunch of their data sets, through a central agency so that people can access it. I mean, that's an information asset register, and the value there is all driven by giving people access to it. Now, obviously, I think you've got to have a hypothesis there about what the value is going to be and how people could use it. And then you've got to test that hypothesis so that you can see whether it's worth funding on an ongoing basis. But I mean, I think we're all sort of dancing around that issue of virtuous cycles. Is this a single point in time thing that's one and done, or is this something that's going to have ongoing usage? Is it used for managing some kind of risk that your board or senior executives see as important and worth managing on an ongoing basis? Is it a tool for controlling teams usage? Is it a tool for managing privacy risk on an ongoing basis? You've got the
For
Harradine
sure.
report, federal government in Australia as well, which is literally just every government agency needs to provide a list of files that have been opened to Parliament. And I think it's every 6 months. I mean, again, public facing information asset register.
I've had small involvement in one project where, we were basically trying to collect together a bunch of open data sets to be published online. Stats New Zealand here had a drive to kind of make that happen for a bit. And I found that internally people would say, oh, we can't reuse this information as an asset register because the sort of levels of what we would consider an item or a thing or an asset are completely different in terms of what we would expect to put online or not. And I guess, I mean, the only comment I wanted to make was it's another
Yeah.
example where purpose, it demonstrates the need to understand why you're doing this, and that I think being clear on the how you're going to use the thing, how it's catalytic, I love that, would determine the form. Basically, would determine how you structure the thing you're creating.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are no. It really is that thing, isn't it? There's no. We almost practice records management like it's a value free discipline in some way. And all I mean by that is we talk about records management like it's this incredible general purpose thing. And everybody, just by implementing records management, gains all of these benefits that they would never have had before and couldn't have any other way. But they're general benefits. They're not specific benefits. But then you look at the practice pattern, you look at where it comes from, and I mean the practice pattern is designed to produce an archive. But it's just one of those things where you kind of have to look below. We kind of operate at this level, and then there is a basic assumption under here. Something that we don't think about anymore because it's faded from view, and that's actually we're actually producing an archive. That's the whole records practice pattern in government. And I think that we lose sight of that stuff, and unless we recognise it, I don't think we. Yeah, I think it's a powerful point, Michael. It's one that it's been on my mind a lot recently, particularly with records practices. We're starting to look at some of the practice transition work through one of the RIMPA ambassador streams that I'm part of. And again, we've talked about it a few times here, looking at functional classification. Or now what was it you called it last week? Noun free classification.
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
Wow. Verb, verb based classification.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's
do
brilliant.
think, reflecting on that, it was a bit of a straw man. I'm not really sure that anyone really just has a set of verbs,
No, but it.
but
no, but it really cemented that point for me that the way we do all of these things. I mean, it tells us what's important. And I mean, I think the information asset register is exactly the same thing. What we put in the information asset register, and this is one of these things, and I think it's related to something you said earlier on, Judi. I mean, they can just become these absolute death marches where everyone is, we want every information asset that you have, and we want these 47, no 48, no 55, no 70 characteristics, because we keep thinking, oh well, we're doing it, we might as well add these things. But it's like a comment I made right back at the start of our podcasting. I think about metadata again, that idea of, is it catalytic? What process does it drive afterwards?
Yeah.
Does it trigger something? And I mean, if it doesn't, what? How do we
Why
justify
collect
that?
it?
Mm,
But there are some fairly obvious things that actually open up whole new vistas of, oh my God, now I can look at all the assets that we have that relate to this topic, or are in this format, or are in this place, or whatever it is, or belong to this team. That's
Mm,
yeah.
really useful.
I mean,
yeah.
that too seems to be one of the possibly amazing uses of natural language processing type stuff. It's the problem of, we don't know what we're going to need until, and this idea that, we're going to create metadata. You read some of those standards for metadata, and it's, we or for record keeping and management generally, and it's, we need to consider all future possible uses of this thing that we're doing. And it's like,
Yeah,
really,
good luck
you
with
really
that.
like,
Yeah.
let's create an exercise in futility right at the start of the process. It's,
Yeah. Let's talk
I
about
mean,
that phrase, need to.
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I think there are some really practical issues like that. I think bringing information asset registers back to that, what's the specific purpose, and then thinking about technologies like natural language processing, possibly, if they are efficient enough, and giving us the ability to go back to our content and say, well, we've got this purpose now. We need to retrofit this type of metadata, and we need to retrofit, this thing has become important. Simple example, vulnerable populations. There was a health organization in one of the states here that froze destruction of literally anything across health, because there was a big vulnerable populations um, Royal Commission, and some other things going on. And they had to freeze everything because they couldn't tell you,
Right.
which specific bits related to people who are disabled, or people who have mental health conditions, or people who are
Yeah.
under the age of 18, or they couldn't do it. They had no ability to understand those things. So how do we retrofit that stuff as it becomes important, and as we need to operationalize it? I mean, I think natural language processing and some of these other texts that, Judi, I know you've done a heap of work with, I think they really provide us a way to do that. But
Yeah.
again,
We've been doing a bit of work exactly in that area, combining
Mm.
the domain modeling work I was talking about last week with some natural language processing to try and join things up, so that if we're talking about that particular community, we can pull in all the terms that are relevant and find all the content that uses those terms, for example.
We're almost, I mean, we're saying, look, if you try and think about every future use case, kind of scoffing at that one, like, oh, well, nothing's ever going to work. But then we're also pointing out what a challenge it is when you don't have that information and you do have to retrofit it.
Yes.
So I guess
Yes.
it's reality, right? It's accepting that if you tried to, the cliche is boil the ocean, then, you're never going to get it done. And there are downsides. And that's okay. Everything has downsides.
there's a whole
Hey,
branch of
And
mathematics devoted to this called optimal stopping theory. If you really want to
nice,
understand,
nice.
yeah,
Optimal
literally how to
stopping.
optimal
right.
stopping,
Yeah,
literally how to make decisions about all this sort of stuff.
about Friday, 5 p.m. Um,
Yeah.
One thing that we haven't touched on that I did want to squeeze into this episode is just commenting on ownership and custodians and stewardship and those things. That's
Yeah.
really, I mean, all I wanted to say is that's one of the ones where I see stuff come unglued, where people get really lost in that perfection. Or not, it's not perfection, but they set things at a standard where it's like, we have to know whether, who's the owner of this, and we have to go through this process. And these people are saying bags not, and so we're stuck. And it's like, well, I think that would be one that if I were working on an information asset register, I'd go, okay, what are we going to say about that from the start so that we don't get stuck?
Yeah.
Just
Totally.
because,
Oh,
you
yes,
know,
absolutely.
it's like, what's enough? we talked about that lost stuff, the stuff that everyone doesn't want to claim. Agree at the start. What are we going to do about that? What are we going to do when we don't know what an owner is? What are we going to do when we don't know who the stewards are? So what? How does that link into the purpose? How does that link into how this is going to be catalytic for this organization? And then off we go. So just as a last comment, I guess I just want to drop that
Yeah,
in there.
I totally agree. Totally agree.
I was going to pick one problem to solve first:
Mhm.
ownership. I have never seen so much rank
Ah,
life as over ownership. When it comes time to do things like destroy stuff and those kinds of things. Oh my god. Yeah, big problem. But thorny as well, with
yeah.
no
Well,
easy.
and so I think that's where I'm basically saying, where do you put your design effort when you start? Like we know
Mm.
that putting some effort into design will make things go better, right? So what's that effort? Like what effort could you put in around the thorniness and acknowledging that thorniness and acknowledging that it's not going to be awesome, and you still want to keep going, otherwise, what are you doing it for? Yeah.
I think, what are
I
your
would
value judgments?
I would just say you can make the decision to start small and then just dig deeper where you need to.
Mm.
That would be a perfectly reasonable decision to make. But also bear in mind that sometimes it's a lot easier to just ask those additional questions when you've got somebody's attention.
Yeah.
So you don't have to go back to them again. It's easier to just ask them another 3 questions or whatever it is. Gather as
Mm.
much as you can get from them without annoying them, I think would be my advice.
Yeah.
But
And I
I think
suppose
that,
all I'm really getting to is just what to do next when someone just gives you a crap
Yeah.
answer. How
Yeah,
do you
right.
proceed? How do you proceed rather than going, oh no, I need to go back to them again and again and again, or
Yes, yes,
how do you
yes.
not flounder? Mm.
I think that too. I mean, I think we're starting to circle back to some of those general challenges of, what is this thing for? Who cares about it? How much of a priority is it? What problem does it solve? How important is that problem? I mean, I think we're starting to circle back to some of those things, because I mean, ownership really comes out of a lot of those things. Your ability to ask for, a certain level of information comes out of those things. Your ability to make a decision about, do we need to get, consultants in to do this thing, because we can probably get, teams to sit with someone for 2 hours and talk about what they do and where the things they use to do it are, but we're not going to be able to push them hard enough to get them to task someone to spend a week on this thing. Like, I think all of those decisions really, a lot of what we're talking about really rolls back to understanding those things and how much fuel they give you to get something done. And there's as I said, there's a whole branch of mathematics for that. Maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need a mathematician on board next week or something.
Maybe
Probably not.
we've hit our optimal stopping point. I guess I reckon this is a topic where a whole lot of you out there listening will have opinions and experience with doing stuff. So we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear, like, you know, do you find this easy? Has it all been plain sailing for you? Love to hear those stories as well.
Are we overthinking it? Have we had, have we been traumatized by bad experiences?
That's right. Yeah. Hanging on to
Unnecessarily.
the
Have we
scars.
been doing it wrong?
Yeah, well, that's definitely possible. Cool.
Mm.
So thank you, one and all, and we'll catch you again soon. See ya.
Bye.